When I picked up the phone to ask my son Daniel when his wedding would be, my daughter-in-law Melissa looked me straight in the eye, her voice smooth, almost triumphant. "Oh, we already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." The words struck me like ice water poured over my chest. Special people. For 3 years I had paid their rent of $500 every month, bought the couch they sat on, stocked their refrigerator when it was empty, yet I was not special. I stood there in my own living room, the phone suddenly heavy in my hand, watching Daniel avoid my gaze while Melissa shifted comfortably into the cushions I had paid for. Upstairs, in my closet, a cream-colored dress still hung untouched, tags dangling, shoes waiting beside it. I had imagined standing in their wedding photos, smiling. But those pictures would exist without me, as if I had never been part of my only son's life. This was the beginning of a silent war, one they never realized. I was fully prepared to fight, step by step, until justice was mine. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I could hear my own breathing in the quiet room, each inhale like a stone pressing deeper into my chest. Daniel said nothing. He did not defend me. He did not argue with her. He did not even look at me. It was easier for him to let Melissa speak those words. Easier to let me stand there in disbelief. My lips trembled, but I didn't cry. The tears would come later, behind a locked door, away from anyone who could mistake them for weakness. In that moment, I only felt the cold realization settling into my bones. I looked at Melissa again. She was sitting with one leg crossed over the other, her nails freshly painted, her expression perfectly at ease. It was as if she had rehearsed this moment, as if she had wanted me to hear her voice delivering that line. Special people. I whispered the words inside my head, trying to make sense of them, but the more I repeated them, the more absurd they became. I had been the one to rescue them when they couldn't make rent. I had been the one to pick out furniture, to deliver groceries. I had even given Melissa money for little things she said she needed: new shoes, a doctor's appointment, a dress. All those things, and still I was not considered special. I tried to steady myself by glancing toward the window. The sunlight was streaming in, warm, golden, steady, as though the world hadn't changed in the last minute. Outside, the neighbors were mowing their lawns, children were riding bikes down the street, and everything was exactly as it had always been. But inside, I felt the ground shift. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, almost rehearsed. "Mom, it was just something small. Only the two of us, and a couple of witnesses." I didn't believe him. Not when I had already seen the pictures on my phone. Their wedding wasn't small. Her family had been there, lined up in their finest clothes, raising glasses of champagne. They had posed proudly for the camera while Melissa beamed in her gown. An $800 gown I had unknowingly helped finance, thinking the money was for her medical bills. The phone slipped a little in my grip as my chest tightened. I had imagined this moment differently. I had pictured walking into the ceremony, maybe with a little box holding the $1,000 I'd set aside as their wedding gift. I had pictured sitting among other family members, smiling proudly as they exchanged vows. I had pictured taking photos that I could frame and set on the mantel beside the ones of Daniel as a little boy. Instead, I stood in silence, my reality unraveling thread by thread. Melissa tilted her head and added, almost mockingly, "You understand, right? It was intimate. We wanted it to be about love. About us." My mind screamed, but wasn't my love part of that? Hadn't I been pouring love into their lives with every sacrifice I made? The hypocrisy burned. I wanted to answer her, to tell her no, I didn't understand, that I would never understand how a mother could be erased from the most important day of her son's life. But my voice betrayed me. It remained trapped in my throat, heavy and unspoken. Instead, I turned my eyes to Daniel. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze on the floor. He couldn't look at me. That was worse than anything Melissa said. Because silence, from your own child, is its own form of betrayal. I closed my eyes for a moment and let my thoughts wander upstairs, to that closet. I saw the cream-colored dress hanging there, imagined the shoes waiting beside it. I had bought them not because I wanted to look glamorous, but because I wanted to look like I belonged in the pictures, like I belonged in their story. The dress had been my small way of saying, "I am proud to be your mother," but it would never be worn. It was useless now, a relic of an illusion. As the seconds dragged by, I felt something within me shift. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was clarity. A harsh, unforgiving clarity that told me I could never go back to how things were before. I couldn't keep pretending that I mattered in their world. The phone buzzed in my hand again, startling me out of my thoughts. For a moment, I thought Daniel might be trying to explain himself. But no, it was a text message. Rent is overdue. Can you make the transfer today? I laughed then, not out of humor but out of disbelief. Not an apology, not even an acknowledgement of what had just been said. Just another request for money. The absurdity of it made the corners of my mouth twitch, though my eyes remained heavy with unshed tears. I walked slowly to the staircase, my free hand trailing along the banister I had polished so many times before. Every step felt like I was moving deeper into a realization that had been waiting for me all along. Upstairs, I pushed open the closet door. There it was, the cream-colored dress, still wrapped in clear plastic. I reached out and touched the fabric with my fingertips. It was smooth, cool, lifeless. The shoes sat in their box, pristine, waiting. My heart clenched as I imagined the smile I would have worn, the photos I would have treasured, the moment that would never exist. I let my hand drop, and with it, the weight of all the illusions I had carried. I whispered under my breath, "So I was never special." The words tasted bitter like ashes. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone resting beside me, and stared at the carpet. 3 years. $33,400. That was the tally of my devotion. I had cut corners in my own life to make theirs comfortable. I had gone without dinners out, vacations, small indulgences. All for them. And yet, when the time came to acknowledge me, they had erased me without hesitation. The house was silent, but inside me, the silence was not empty. It was heavy, pressing, alive. I felt it filling the spaces where my illusions had once lived. I knew then that this silence would become my companion, my shield, my weapon. The doorbell rang suddenly, sharp and unexpected. My heart leapt. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if Daniel had come back, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to try to explain. I hurried down the stairs, but when I opened the door, it was only the delivery man dropping off a package. I stood there for a second, holding the box, watching him walk away, and realized that even strangers gave me more acknowledgement than my own son. I placed the package on the counter, sat back on the couch, and stared at the spot where Melissa had been sitting earlier, so smug, so confident. I could still hear her voice, echoing in my mind. Special people. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the memory burn itself into me. I would not forget this moment. I would not forgive it. Because sometimes, the only way to survive betrayal is to remember it clearly enough to build something stronger from its ashes. That night, when I finally went to bed, sleep did not come easily. My mind replayed everything over and over, as if trying to find a different outcome, a different choice that could have changed it. But there was none. There was only this path forward, a path I had never chosen but one that now lay open before me. I whispered to myself, almost as a promise, "They will never see me coming." And with that, I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle over me, knowing that in the morning, the war would begin. The night after Melissa's words, I couldn't sleep. The phrase kept circling in my mind like a bird that had lost its way. Special people. I turned from one side to the other, my body restless, but it wasn't my body that was unsettled, it was my memory. Every sacrifice I had made began to resurface in painful detail, as if my mind had been keeping a meticulous ledger I had tried too long to ignore. 3 years. That was the length of time since Daniel and Melissa had moved into their little apartment across town. The first month, Daniel had called me late at night, his voice shaking. "Mom, we're short on rent. Just $500. We'll pay you back as soon as Melissa gets her next paycheck." I had felt a tug of maternal instinct, the same instinct that had pulled me out of bed countless nights when Daniel was a little boy, crying from a nightmare. I wired the money the next morning without hesitation. That was the beginning. And it never stopped. $500 became a ritual, like paying my own bills, like refilling the gas tank. The first week of every month, I drove to the bank, signed the slip, and watched my account dip lower. I told myself it was temporary, that they were young, that they needed a head start. But month after month, the temporary became permanent. The number stacked quietly, until it no longer felt like 500 here or there. It was entire vacations never taken, repairs on my house delayed, a future retirement trip postponed. I remember opening my refrigerator one evening and seeing only milk and eggs. My paycheck had been stretched thin, and yet I had just sent Melissa money because she claimed she couldn't cover groceries that week. When I asked her what she bought, she laughed lightly. "Just the basics, Claire." And I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe I was still feeding my son, even if it was through her. There was one night she called me while Daniel was at work. Her voice was soft, careful, almost affectionate. "Claire, you're like a second mom to me." I felt my chest swell with warmth, foolish as it seems now. I told her I was glad she felt that way. She sighed and then slipped in the reason for the call. "We're a little behind on the electric bill. Could you maybe help us this one time?" And I did. I wrote the check, drove it over, handed it to her in person. She hugged me, her perfume strong, her voice sweet in my ear. "Thank you, Mom." For years I carried that moment like a token of closeness. Only now do I see it was just another tool in her collection of practiced words. I got up from bed that restless night and walked into the hallway. The wooden floor creaked softly, a sound I had heard for decades, the sound of a house that had carried my life through storms and celebrations. I walked to the study, opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and pulled it open. Inside were the records. Neatly stacked receipts, wire confirmations, yellowing envelopes, every proof of every time I had chosen them over myself. The papers rustled as I spread them out across the desk. My hands trembled, not from age but from the realization of the sheer volume of it all. Each slip of paper was a piece of me. There was the rent payment from last July, the grocery money from February, the cash for Melissa's so-called emergency dentist visit. I remembered that night vividly. She had texted me a photo of a swollen cheek, pleading for help. Later, I found out she had gone shopping that same afternoon. The drawer smelled faintly of ink and old wood. I traced my finger down the lines of numbers, each one like a scar carved into my savings. 500, 200, 800, 1200. Every figure was a reminder that my love had been measured, calculated, drained. I leaned back in the chair and shut my eyes. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw Daniel as a little boy again, standing by my bedside in the middle of the night. "Mom, I had a bad dream." I reached for him, pulled him close, whispered, "You're safe, sweetheart. I'm your safe place." That phrase came back to me now like a knife, because somewhere between the boy who clung to me and the man who now looked away in shame, I had lost him. The sound of Melissa's voice returned, her words laced with sugar, calling me a second mom. It wasn't love. It was a transaction, disguised in affection. She had known exactly what to say to disarm me, to open my wallet, to keep me pliable. And Daniel, my son, had allowed it, had encouraged it. I stared at the papers until the edges blurred. The clock ticked on the wall, each second another reminder of time I had given away. I had believed that supporting them was an act of love. But true love doesn't keep tally marks. True love doesn't require receipts. And yet here they all were, silent witnesses to my mistake. I remembered a particular Christmas. The snow had fallen heavy that year, blanketing the streets in silence. I had wrapped gifts for them, sweaters for Daniel, a necklace for Melissa. But when I visited their apartment, their tree was surrounded by boxes from department stores, all of them clearly expensive. Melissa had laughed, her hands full of gold-trimmed packages, and she had said, "Don't worry, Claire, your gift is special too." But I saw the way her eyes flickered with impatience when she unwrapped the modest necklace I'd chosen. Later that evening, she asked quietly if I could help with the credit card bill. I closed my eyes and felt the ache in my chest deepen. They had taken my kindness and dressed it in false gratitude. Every thank you was another chain around my neck. The night wore on as I sat at the desk, papers scattered around me like fallen leaves. My hand reached for the drawer again, and with a sharp tug, I slid it closed. The wooden click echoed in the room, firm and final. It felt like drawing a line. I whispered into the stillness, "I have been enough. I am enough." And yet to them, I was never special. My phone buzzed again on the desk. For a long time, I didn't look at it. When I finally did, the message glared back at me. Melissa's words, curt and casual. "Did you forget the transfer?" The landlord is pressuring us. We need it now. I stared at the message, my fingers still. For years I would have rushed, put on my coat, driven to the bank without a second thought. But that night, I didn't move. Instead, I leaned back, letting the silence envelop me. It was the first time in years that I didn't obey the pull of their demands. The first time I let the weight of their need fall to the floor instead of onto my shoulders. I walked back to my bedroom slowly, every step deliberate. The papers remained locked away, their numbers etched into me, but no longer defining me. I closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the faint glow of the moon through the window. My heart still ached, but beneath the ache was something sturdier, something awakening. Love, I realized, should never have been turned into a duty, never reduced to an obligation paid in bills and wire transfers. Somewhere along the way, my devotion had been twisted into currency. And that realization hurt more than Melissa's words. It meant that for 3 years I had been complicit in my own erasure. The night ended with me lying on my back, staring at the ceiling. I felt the echo of Daniel's childhood voice in my ears. "Mom, you're my safe place." And I answered him silently in my head. I was. But not anymore. As the house settled into its usual creaks and sighs, I let out a long breath and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I knew, would come with more demands. More buzzing phones, more hollow words, but something had changed in me, and when I finally drifted into sleep, it was not with dread, but with a strange, quiet resolve. The next morning I woke early. The sky outside was pale blue, the air crisp. I dressed slowly, my movements unhurried, as if savoring the control of each simple action. I walked into the study, opened the drawer again, and looked at the stack of receipts. My fingers brushed across them one last time before I closed the drawer with a firm push. The click echoed again. This time it sounded less like regret and more like a promise. I whispered to myself, barely audible but steady, "No more." And with that, I walked away from the drawer, the weight of 3 years of sacrifice locked behind it. That morning I stood in the bathroom, staring at the reflection that stared back at me. The woman in the mirror looked tired, not just from age, but from years of bending, of giving, of diminishing herself so others could shine. My hair was pulled back in its usual knot, my eyes shadowed from another sleepless night. I searched that reflection, and what I saw made my chest ache. I didn't see a mother. I didn't see the woman who once held her little boy against her chest, promising the world would be kind to him. What I saw was a provider, a sponsor, a woman whose life had been rewritten into bank slips and wire transfers. I had become their benefactor, not their family. I whispered the truth to myself, and it was bitter. I was not a mother in their story. I was their financier. I turned away from the mirror, but the image followed me like a shadow. In the kitchen, the kettle hissed, and I poured water over the coffee grounds. The steam rose in lazy curls, carrying the smell of roasted beans that used to comfort me. For the first time in years, I wasn't brewing coffee while rushing to check my phone for their messages. I wasn't calculating how to make sure my bills were paid after sending them another transfer. I simply stood still, watching the steam twist upward, realizing the cup I was about to pour was for me. Just me. The coffee sat warm in my hands, the porcelain cup radiating heat into my palms. I carried it to the table where I had so many times counted bills for Daniel and Melissa's expenses. This morning the table belonged to me. I took the first sip slowly. It was slightly bitter, but in that bitterness there was a strange sweetness, a quiet declaration. This cup was mine, not drained by obligation, not diluted by their demands. The thought came suddenly, sharp and cold. How much had I given? Not just in feeling, but in dollars, cents, checks signed, wires sent. I went back to the desk in my study and pulled out the drawer again. The papers stared up at me. I sat down with my cup beside me and began to add. Line by line, month by month, gift by gift. The pen in my hand moved across the page until my eyes blurred. My breath caught as the number appeared in front of me. Undeniable, final. $33,400. The figure might as well have been carved into stone. I leaned back in my chair and stared at it, my chest tight. That was a car. That was years of retirement security. That was a dream trip I had spoken about for so long, shelved for later, for someday. Instead, it had vanished into rent payments, utility bills, groceries, gifts, emergencies that weren't emergencies. $33,400. I said it out loud, my voice steady, and in saying it, something inside me hardened. I thought of Melissa's voice, sugar-coated when she had called me her second mom. I thought of Daniel's silence, his eyes darting away as if my existence embarrassed him. I thought of the endless cycle of giving, waiting for a scrap of gratitude that never came. And now, the number glared at me, a monument to the years I had been erased by my own generosity. I finished my coffee, letting the warmth travel through me like a quiet resolve. The cup sat empty on the table, its rim marked by the faint trace of my lipstick. I placed it down with care, as if sealing a vow. That simple act, drinking a cup of coffee, meant for me was my first act of defiance, my first act of reclaiming. The decision formed slowly but with certainty. I would no longer let my money be drained. I would no longer let my life be dictated by their demands. I knew what I needed to do, and it terrified me as much as it freed me. I had to stop the transfers. That afternoon, I drove to the bank. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, and the familiar smell of polished floors and faint printer ink filled my senses. For years, this place had been a temple where I performed my monthly ritual of sacrifice. But today, I entered with a different purpose. The clerk behind the counter, a young man with kind eyes, greeted me. "Mrs. Matthews, how can we help you today?" I placed my papers on the desk, my hands steady. I need to cancel all automatic transfers to Daniel and Melissa Carter. His brows lifted in surprise. "Are you sure, Mrs. Matthews? These transfers have been consistent for years." He hesitated, his tone almost protective. "Did something happen?" I looked him in the eye, feeling the weight of the moment. "For the first time in years, yes, I am sure." He nodded and began typing on his computer, his fingers clicking softly against the keys. As he worked, I felt a strange lightness, as if every keystroke erased a burden from my shoulders. He handed me a form to sign, the paper crisp under my hand. I signed my name with a flourish, the pen gliding easily, and when I handed it back, I felt something inside me shift. The clerk smiled politely, but his eyes were gentle. "Everything is processed, Mrs. Matthews. There will be no further transfers. Is there anything else we can do for you today?" I shook my head. "No. You've already done more than you realize." Walking out of the bank, the air felt fresher, the sky brighter. I stood on the sidewalk, holding my purse tightly, and allowed myself to breathe. It wasn't a grand victory. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. But it was the first decision I had made for myself in a very long time. When I got home, the phone was ringing. It rang and rang, the shrill tone cutting through the silence. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Melissa, maybe Daniel, maybe both. Their voices would be waiting, desperate, demanding. But I didn't answer. I let it ring until it stopped, until the house returned to its quiet hum. A few minutes later, it started again, persistent, insistent. I stared at it from across the room and felt no compulsion to pick it up. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen, poured myself another cup of coffee, and sat by the window. The phone continued to ring, but I lifted the cup to my lips, ignoring it. Outside, the world carried on. The neighbor walked his dog, children shouted as they played, a car drove past. Life went on, and for once, I was in it as myself, not as a servant to their needs. As the coffee warmed me, I realized that awakening isn't a thunderclap. It isn't one sudden explosion of clarity. It is small moments, like this one, where you choose silence over obedience, peace over obligation. It was the click of a drawer, the signing of a form, the refusal to answer a call. Little acts, but strung together, they formed a chain strong enough to pull me out of the shadows I had lived in. That evening, the phone was still. Perhaps they had grown tired of trying, or perhaps they were planning their next words. I didn't care. I sat on the couch, the one I had bought for them years ago, and for the first time it didn't feel like their couch. It felt like mine again. The fabric beneath my hand was worn but familiar. I leaned back and let the silence settle over me. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "This is the beginning." The message was clear in my heart. I was no longer just Daniel's mother, Melissa's supporter. I was Claire Matthews, a woman who had been erased but was now drawing her own outline back into existence. And if they thought I would continue to serve without question, they had gravely underestimated me. The night came quietly. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness fold around me, not as something to fear, but as something to cradle me while I found my strength again. In that darkness, I saw the number again. 33,400. It burned into my mind, not as a wound, but as a reminder. That was the cost of my blindness. I would not pay it again. The phone buzzed once more on the nightstand. I glanced at it, watched the screen light up with Melissa's name, and then watched it fade back into blackness as the call went unanswered. That was my final act of the day, the punctuation mark on my awakening. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep, not with dread, not with guilt, but with a calm certainty that the tide had turned. The call came in the middle of the afternoon. I had just finished folding a small load of laundry, the kind of chore that used to be background noise while I worried about their bills or their groceries. Now the task felt light, almost grounding. The phone buzzed on the counter, its vibration echoing across the wood. I glanced at the screen. Melissa. For a moment, I let it ring. My heart thudded once, hard, then steadied. Curiosity got the better of me, and I swiped to answer. Her voice was sharp with desperation, but laced with that practiced sweetness she always used when she wanted something. Claire, thank God you picked up. The rent is overdue. The landlord says if we don't pay this week, he'll kick us out. You forgot the transfer. The word forgot twisted in my chest, as if my silence, my refusal, my choice had been an accident, as if my life existed to cover their negligence. I pressed the phone closer to my ear and let her speak, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. She talked about late fees, about pressure, about Daniel working extra shifts that never seemed to cover anything. She spoke as if this were my emergency, not hers. I didn't interrupt. I let her fill the silence with her panic. When her voice cracked, when she whispered, Claire, please, you've always been there for us. You're like a mother to me. That was when I felt the weight of her words finally land. Like a mother. Not mother. Not family. Like a stand-in. A role she could play when it suited her. My lips curved, not into a smile, but into something sharper, steadier. I inhaled, letting the air settle inside me, and then answered with the calmest tone I could manage. Melissa, didn't I warn you? I only help special people. The silence that followed was so heavy, I could hear my own breath in the receiver. For a second, I thought the line had dropped. Then her voice came back, trembling, stripped of confidence. Claire, I don't understand. We were always special to you. You always said we were family. You said you loved us. I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. Lies. Rehearsed lines. Lines she had used every time she needed money. Lines I had swallowed because I wanted to believe them. No, Melissa, you weren't family. I was your bank. The words left me with surprising ease, like they had been waiting on my tongue for years. I pictured her face, the practiced shock, the way her mouth would tighten before she reached for another script. Claire, you don't mean that. You can't mean that. But I did. For the first time in years, I meant every word. I stood at the window, the phone pressed to my ear, and let the sunlight pour over me. It spilled through the glass in golden sheets, warming my face, illuminating the truth I had buried. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't rushing to grab my purse and drive to the bank. I was still, centered, resolved. Melissa's voice cracked again. You don't understand. Daniel and I are drowning. We thought you cared about us. We thought you wanted us safe. I looked at the streak of light across the floor, sharp and clean. I do care. That's why I'm telling you the truth. Caring is not paying your rent. Caring is not selling my peace for your comfort. Her breathing grew louder, more frantic. You can't do this. We've built our lives knowing you'd help us. We counted on you. There it was, the confession, the entitlement laid bare. My hand didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. I simply answered, then maybe it's time you build your lives on something else. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, followed by silence so thick I could almost hear her thoughts scrambling. She tried one more time, her tone softer, the plea rehearsed to perfection. Claire, please. We love you. We need you. I exhaled slowly, watching the dust dance in the sunlight. Love that needs a wire transfer is not love. And as for needing me, you never needed me. You needed my money. I lowered the phone, her voice still calling my name. My thumb hovered for only a second before I pressed the red button. The sharp electronic beep filled the air as the line went dead. I stood there, the phone heavy but no longer a chain. The room was quiet again, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of a bird outside the window. I felt the stillness seep into me, steadying me. For years, their voices had dictated my days. Their emergencies had pulled me from my own life. But in that moment, I had taken the first swing back. Not with shouting, not with rage, but with their own words, reflected back like a mirror they couldn't bear to see. I placed the phone face down on the table and sat with my coffee. The sunlight warmed my skin, and for once the warmth didn't come with guilt. I thought of all the times Melissa had said, "You're like a mother to me." Each time, it had been a key to open my wallet. Now, the key no longer fit. The phone began to buzz again, vibrating against the wood, louder, more insistent. I didn't pick it up. The sound went on, stopped, then started again. I sipped my coffee and let it ring. Each unanswered call was another layer of armor, another proof that I was no longer theirs to control. The buzzing finally stopped, leaving only silence, and in that silence, I heard the faint echo of my own voice. I only help special people. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had been excluded by those words. But now, by speaking them myself, I had turned them into something else, a boundary, a declaration, a weapon. The day went on, the phone buzzing every so often, but I no longer flinched. I opened the window, let the breeze in, and sat at my table. Outside, life continued. A child pedaled a bicycle past, a neighbor waved from her garden, the world spun on. I wasn't excluded anymore. I had chosen to step out of their circle, to draw my own. That night, before I turned off the lamp, I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to myself, sometimes revenge isn't fire. Sometimes it's simply holding up the truth and letting it burn on its own. And with that, I let the darkness fold around me, steady, quiet, and utterly mine. It happened on a gray afternoon when the air felt unusually heavy, the kind of day when even the silence inside my house seemed too loud. I was in the kitchen rinsing out a teacup when I heard the front door open. At first I thought I had forgotten to lock it, but then I remembered I hadn't changed the locks yet. I froze. Footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor, firm and deliberate, not hesitant like a neighbor or delivery man. When I stepped into the living room, my breath caught. Daniel stood there, his shoulders hunched but his jaw set, Melissa just behind him with her arms folded across her chest. Beside them was a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit with an expensive briefcase dangling from one hand. His eyes scanned the room like he owned it. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice steady but too polished, too rehearsed. "This is Mr. Dalton. He's here to help us sort things out." Melissa added quickly, "We were worried about you. You haven't been yourself." The words hit like an accusation dressed up as concern. I wiped my hand slowly on a towel, refusing to show the tremor in my fingers. "Sort what out?" I asked. Dalton stepped forward, placing his briefcase on my dining table with a heavy thud. The sound made me flinch. That table, once a place where I had set Daniel's birthday cakes, where laughter had filled the room, now bore the weight of something colder. He unclasped the case, and papers spilled out in neat stacks, forms heavy with legal jargon. "Mrs. Matthews," he began, his tone professional, almost kind but with an edge that felt sharp enough to cut. "Your children are concerned about your well-being. They've noticed unusual financial behavior and think it's best if you allow them to help manage your affairs." Melissa's voice softened into its manipulative cadence. "Claire, we're just protecting you." I felt my jaw tighten. Protecting me from what? My own money? Daniel's eyes flickered, but he pressed on. "You've been acting different, Mom. Canceling transfers without explanation. Cutting yourself off. We think you need a little guidance." Dalton slid a document across the table toward me, his manicured hand tapping the corner, as if coaxing me to pick it up. "This is a power of attorney, Mrs. Matthews. Very straightforward. It simply allows Daniel and Melissa to help oversee your finances, to make sure nothing gets mismanaged. Just a precaution." I stared at the paper, the lines of text blurring for a moment. The table felt foreign beneath my hands. I remembered little hands smearing frosting on this same wood. Daniel blowing out candles while I clapped and laughed. Now those memories were buried beneath contracts and lies. Melissa leaned forward, her voice low and insistent. "Claire, you always said we were family, that we could trust each other. This is just a formality. We'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry anymore." Something inside me snapped, not violently, but with clarity. I had worried for years, carried every burden, paid every bill, and now they wanted to erase even my ability to say no. I lifted my eyes to Daniel. "Do you even hear yourself? You're asking me to hand over the life I built, the savings I worked for, as if I'm incompetent." He flinched at the word but recovered quickly. "It's not like that, Mom, it's just safer this way." "Safer? For whom?" I whispered, but the words came out sharp enough to sting. Dalton cleared his throat. "Mrs. Matthews, it's really in everyone's best interest. Why don't you sign and we can move on from all this unpleasantness?" I picked up the paper, my fingers brushing against the crisp edge. For a second, I imagined what it would mean to sign. The house, the accounts, the small freedoms I still had all gone, placed neatly into their hands. I saw Melissa's smug smile flash in my mind, saw Daniel's avoidance, saw myself disappearing into the role of a ward instead of a woman. "No." The word fell into the room like a stone dropped in water, rippling across their faces. Melissa's eyes widened, Daniel's mouth tightened, Dalton's professional mask cracked for just a second. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice strained, "you're not thinking clearly." I straightened my shoulders, my voice steadier than I felt. "I am thinking more clearly than I have in years." Melissa's mask slipped, her voice rising with frustration. "We're trying to save you from yourself. Don't you see? You can't manage this on your own anymore." I looked at her, my gaze unwavering. "I managed just fine before you ever came along." The room went still. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Dalton shifted, his polished shoes squeaking against the floor. "If you refuse," he said, his voice lower now, "your children may have no choice but to take this to court. A judge could determine you're not capable of managing your finances. It would be harder that way. This document is the simpler path." I stared at him, then at the table beneath my hands. Once it had been covered in candles and confetti, now it was littered with threats disguised as paperwork. The contrast cut into me, but it also fueled me. Slowly, I lifted the papers, held them for a moment, then walked toward the kitchen trash can. My footsteps echoed deliberately. Daniel started forward. "Mom, don't." But I didn't stop. I dropped the stack into the bin. The sound of paper crumpling, falling was sharper than any scream. Melissa gasped, her face flushing red. "You can't just throw away our future." I turned back, my voice cold and even. "It's not your future to begin with." Daniel's face twisted, caught between shame and anger. He clenched his fists but didn't move. Dalton sighed, closing his briefcase with a snap. "Very well, Mrs. Matthews, if that's your choice. But I advise you to prepare for what comes next." Melissa hissed under her breath, her words venomous. "You'll regret this, Claire." I walked back to the table, my hands steady. "Regret is what got me here. I'm done with it." The silence stretched, tense and suffocating. Finally, Dalton gathered his things and gestured for them to follow. Daniel lingered for a moment, his eyes flicking toward me, something almost like guilt flickering in them, but he turned and walked out. Melissa slammed the door harder than necessary, the sound reverberating through the walls. The house was still again. The papers were buried in the trash, their threat neutralized for now. I stood by the window, the late afternoon light streaming across my face. My heart pounded, but beneath it, I felt a strange calm, a steadiness I hadn't known in years. I whispered into the silence, almost to myself, protecting me from my own money. What a clever lie. I walked back to the table, ran my hand over its surface, remembering birthdays and dinners, the laughter of a boy who once called me his safe place. That table would no longer hold contracts meant to erase me. It would hold my choices, my strength, my return to myself. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, I realized the war had only just begun. The morning after Daniel and Melissa stormed out with their lawyer, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty coffee cup in front of me. The silence of the house pressed on me, but it wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence before a storm. I knew they weren't finished. The papers Dalton had tried to force on me weren't the end of their schemes, they were just the beginning. And for the first time, instead of shrinking from that knowledge, I leaned into it. If they wanted war, I couldn't fight it with anger alone. I needed something sharper, something stronger than tears or stubborn refusals. I needed the law. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Harrison and Associates. The voice on the other end was professional, calm. Mrs. Matthews, Mr. Harrison can see you this afternoon. Bring any documents you have. When I hung up, I went straight to the study. I opened the drawer that had become my private archive of pain receipts, transfers, notes scribbled in the margins of envelopes. I pulled out every last one and placed them neatly into a worn manila folder. For years, those papers had been silent witnesses to my sacrifice. Now they would speak. Driving downtown, my hands gripped the steering wheel tight. The streets looked the same, people rushing about their business, the world moving forward, as if mine hadn't been cracked open. I parked in front of the law office, a tall brick building with clean windows and polished brass handles. My reflection caught in the glass doors before I stepped inside. I looked smaller than I remembered, but I also looked steadier. The receptionist guided me into a large office, lined with bookshelves heavy with leather-bound volumes. At the center sat a man in his 60s, his hair silver, his posture firm, but not intimidating. Harrison stood as I entered, his handshake warm and confident. "Mrs. Matthews, please sit. Tell me what brings you here." I sat across from him, the folder of documents resting on my lap like a weight I was finally ready to release. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling foolish, feeling exposed. But then the memory of Melissa's smirk, Daniel's silence, and Dalton's papers filled my chest with fire. I slid the folder across the desk. This is 3 years of my life. 3 years of support, of payments, of sacrifices. And last week, they tried to take everything else by forcing me to sign away my rights. Harrison opened the folder and began flipping through the papers with practiced care. His brows furrowed slightly as he read, his pen tapping against the desk. I sat quietly, the clock ticking somewhere behind me, until he finally looked up. His eyes were steady, and his words were precise. "Mrs. Matthews, you are not crazy. You are a victim." The phrase hit me harder than I expected. A victim. I had called myself foolish, naive, even blind. But never that word. He leaned forward. "This is elder financial abuse, plain and simple. And it's not just immoral, it's a federal crime." The words settled over me like a blanket, heavy but protective. For the first time, I felt the shift. It wasn't just me against them anymore. The law had a name for what they were doing, and names carry power. Harrison continued, his voice calm but firm. "They've manipulated you, coerced you, drained your resources, and when you tried to stop, they escalated by bringing in legal threats. That pattern is classic. You need protection. And we can get it for you." I exhaled, the tension in my chest easing just enough to let in air. "What do I need to do?" He pulled a new folder from his desk drawer, this one clean black leather, its edges neat and crisp. He slid it toward me, opening it to reveal contracts and forms, unlike the chaotic pile I had at home. Each page was orderly, purposeful, protective. "This," he said, "is the start. We'll document every transfer, every demand, every incident. We'll file a restraining order if they try to pressure you again. We'll secure your accounts so they cannot touch a cent without your consent." His words steadied me, each one like a stone laid into a foundation I hadn't realized I needed. I thought of my dining table at home, covered in Dalton's threats, papers spilling like poison. Here, in Harrison's office, the documents were stacked in order, secured in polished leather, a symbol of control instead of chaos. I traced the edge of the pen he handed me. My hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the enormity of the choice. For years, every signature I'd given had been for them for rent checks, for bills, for gifts. Now, for the first time, I was signing for myself. Harrison's gaze met mine as I poised the pen. "Once we file this, they can't bully you without consequence. You'll have the law behind you. Are you ready?" I thought of Melissa's words, "You're like a mother to me," followed by her demands. I thought of Daniel's eyes, refusing to meet mine. I thought of the phrase that had haunted me, "special people." My throat tightened, but my voice came clear. I'm ready. The pen moved across the page. My name, written with finality, felt like reclaiming something I had given away too long. As the ink dried, I felt the shift inside me again. Not a victim, not a financier, a woman with rights. A woman with recourse. Harrison closed the folder gently and set it aside, his expression resolute. You've done the hardest part, Mrs. Matthews. You asked for help. Now let us carry some of this weight. For a moment my eyes stung, but I didn't let the tears fall. I had cried enough in silence. This time, the weight in my chest felt lighter, transformed into something sharper. Resolve. We talked for another hour, mapping out the steps. He asked questions, noted dates, highlighted inconsistencies in Melissa and Daniel's stories. Each answer I gave felt like adding another brick to the wall between me and their control. When it was time to leave, he walked me to the door. You are not alone anymore, he said simply. I stepped outside into the cool air, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. In my purse, the signed contract rested within the leather folder, neat and orderly. It felt like carrying armor. As I drove home, the phone buzzed again on the seat beside me. Melissa's name lit up the screen. I let it ring, the sound swallowed by the hum of the engine. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the call had ended. A new voicemail waited, but I didn't listen. Not yet. Inside the house, I set the leather folder on the kitchen counter. Its clean lines looked foreign against the ordinary clutter of my life. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table, and let the silence of the room wrap around me. For the first time, that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like protection. The phone buzzed again, persistent. I looked at it, then turned it face down. My eyes drifted back to the folder. In that simple object paper arranged neatly, bound in leather, I saw the difference between their chaos and my control. Between the years I had been erased and the future I was now choosing. That night, before I went to bed, I placed the folder on the nightstand beside me. As the lamp light glowed, I whispered into the quiet. Justice begins when you stop apologizing for asking it to protect you. I turned off the light, the room falling into darkness, the folder still there like a promise. And for the first time in years, I slept without fear. The first sign of the storm came not with a knock on the door, but with the low hum of my new security cameras. I had installed them after my meeting with Mr. Pross, after my meeting with Mr. Process. Harrison, small black eyes perched at the corners of my home, quiet guardians that recorded everything. That morning while I was sipping coffee at the kitchen table, my phone lit up with an alert. Motion detected. I tapped the screen and there they were, Melissa's car idling at the curb, Daniel pacing the sidewalk, and just behind them, a familiar figure I did not expect. My neighbor, Mr. O'Connor, the man who had barely spoken 2 polite words to me in years, now leaned casually against his fence, nodding at them. His arms folded across his chest, his face smug. Something inside me went cold. It wasn't long before I understood what was happening. Daniel had recruited him, a witness, a mouth ready to parrot whatever story they were weaving. 2 days later, another alert. I checked the footage and saw Melissa entering the pharmacy near town, her smile wide and practiced as she chatted with Mr. Mitchell, the pharmacist I had trusted for over a decade. I couldn't hear their words, but I could read the gestures. Her hand placed on his arm, her face tilted in that performance of concern she had perfected. I knew the script without hearing it. She was painting me as unstable, forgetful, confused. She was planting seeds. The fury that rose in me was sharp, but it didn't blind me. It clarified. They weren't just asking anymore. They were constructing a case, piece by piece, lie by lie. That evening, as I washed dishes, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Minutes later it rang again, this time from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked up. A woman's voice, calm and professional, introduced herself. Mrs. Matthews, I'm from the Office of Senior Services. We've received reports from concerned family members about your mental well-being. At your age, confusion is normal. We just want to make sure you're safe. The plate in my hand slipped slightly under the water. Confusion. The word hit like an insult cloaked as care. Reports. I could already imagine Melissa's handwriting in those accusations, each word dripping with false compassion. I steadied my voice. I am clearer than I have been in years. The silence on the line was brief but telling. Then she replied with measured professionalism, "We'll need to schedule a wellness visit, Mrs. Matthews. I'm sure you understand." When I hung up, I stood at the sink, water still running, my hands gripping the porcelain so tightly my knuckles ached. They weren't just spreading whispers anymore. They had gone to the government. They wanted me branded incompetent, erased legally as much as emotionally. Later that night, I sat at the dining table, the camera feeds flickering on my phone beside me. I watched Daniel's figure pass by the house again, Melissa in the passenger seat, her face lit by the glow of her phone. They were circling, as if waiting for me to slip, to show some crack they could exploit. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I whispered to myself, "Let them circle. The cameras see everything." The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of harassment. The phone rang constantly blocked numbers, unknown numbers. Sometimes I answered just to hear the silence before the click, a reminder that they were always just out of sight. Other times it was Daniel's voice, soft and coaxing. "Mom, we're worried. Please don't shut us out." Or Melissa's voice, sticky sweet. "Claire, you need us. You're not well." Each call was a dagger wrapped in velvet. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find a white envelope tucked beneath my door. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. The words on the page made my stomach drop. "You are hereby summoned to appear in family court." The paper slipped from my fingers and landed on the table with a dull thud. I stared at it as if it were a living thing. My heart pounded, but beneath the fear there was something else. A strange steadiness. They wanted a battle in court? Fine. I had already armed myself. I picked up the paper again, this time with purpose. The dining table where Daniel once blew out candles now held a summons to decide whether I was fit to handle my own life. I traced the edges of the page, the ink sharp under my fingertips. I called Mr. Harrison immediately. His voice on the other end was calm, measured. "They're escalating, Mrs. Matthews. But so are we. Remember what I told you. Document everything. We'll fight this with truth." I looked at the black leather folder sitting neatly on the counter, its spine gleaming under the kitchen light. It was a stark contrast to the summons lying open before me. Chaos versus order, lies versus proof. As the sun dipped outside, I closed my eyes and listened to the distant sound of cars passing, the world going on as if nothing had changed. But inside, everything had changed. They had chosen the battlefield, and now it was official. I folded the summons, slid it into Harrison's folder, and placed it carefully on the table. The papers rustled, the sound like a drumbeat announcing the next chapter of war. And though my chest ached with the weight of betrayal, my voice came steady into the quiet. They want to see me broken, but all they'll see is clear. The cameras outside blinked red, recording the night as it settled in. And I sat there ready, waiting, certain that no matter how many lies they gathered, the truth was still mine to hold. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and floor polish, a blend of history and judgment. I walked through the heavy doors with my chin lifted higher than I felt inside. My heels clicked softly on the marble, each sound reminding me that this was not just another errand, not another transfer, not another favor. This was the day my life, my competence, my dignity would be weighed. Inside the courtroom, Daniel and Melissa were already seated with their lawyer, Mr. Dalton. Daniel's suit looked too new, his tie knotted stiff, as if he had dressed himself in respectability he hadn't earned. Melissa wore black, her hair neatly styled, her face pale with a kind of rehearsed sorrow. When her eyes met mine, she didn't flinch. She wanted me to see her confidence, her certainty that today I would be declared unfit. Mr. Harrison touched my arm lightly, guiding me to our table. His presence was steady, like an anchor I hadn't realized I needed until this storm began. He spread out his papers neatly, every page clipped and highlighted. In front of me, he placed a leather folder, the same one that had sat on my kitchen counter like armor. I placed my hand on it and kept it there, grounding myself in its solid weight. Judge Reynolds entered, tall and stern, his gavel striking once, the sound echoing through the chamber. The proceedings began with Dalton's voice filling the room, smooth and persuasive. He painted a picture of me as an old woman unraveling. "Your Honor, in recent months, Mrs. Matthews has displayed concerning behavior, abruptly cutting off long-standing financial support, installing excessive security measures, isolating herself from her family, These are not the actions of a sound mind, but of someone gripped by paranoia. Paranoid. The word sliced through me like a knife. I clenched my hands on the folder, resisting the urge to shout. Harrison leaned closer, whispering, "Let him finish." Dalton continued, each word crafted like a carefully polished stone. Her children have only tried to care for her, to protect her from financial harm, yet she has turned against them, influenced by outsiders. This is why we request legal guardianship to ensure her well-being. Melissa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. Daniel lowered his head as though in grief, but I saw the flicker of satisfaction on his face. The performance was flawless. Then came Harrison's turn. He stood slowly, his presence calm but commanding. "Your Honor, what we have here is not paranoia. What we have is evidence." He lifted a stack of documents, each page crisp, each figure exact. These are bank records. Every transfer Mrs. Matthews made over the past 3 years. Consistent amounts, consistent dates. Not erratic behavior, not confusion. Consistency, reliability, responsibility. He placed the records on the judge's bench with a firm hand. My heart swelled as I saw the order, the clarity. Dalton's words had been smoke. Harrison's were stone. Dalton shifted uncomfortably, but Melissa was called to testify. She rose gracefully, her tissue still in hand, her voice quivering as if rehearsed. "Claire has always been like a mother to me. Seeing her decline has been heartbreaking. She shuts us out, refuses to listen, spends money irrationally. We're only trying to protect her." Harrison stood again, his cross-examination sharp as glass. "Mrs. Carter, when was the last time you called my client without asking for money?" Melissa faltered. I can't remember the exact date." Harrison pressed on. "Is it true that you and your husband were married without inviting her?" Melissa's cheeks flushed. "It was a small ceremony," she muttered. "Did you or did you not tell her only special people were invited?" Her silence was louder than any answer. Daniel testified next. His voice was steady but thin, the same rehearsed cadence I had heard before. "My mother has always been generous, but lately she's not herself. Canceling transfers suddenly. Refusing help. We're scared for her." Harrison stepped forward. "Mr. Matthews, how old are you?" 35. "And your wife?" 32. Harrison paused for effect. "And yet for 3 years, you relied on your 70-year-old mother to pay your rent, buy your groceries, cover your bills. Is that correct?" Daniel shifted, his eyes darting away. "Sometimes, yes, more than sometimes, consistently. Is that protecting her or exploiting her?" Dalton objected, but the damage was done. The truth had cracked through their polished lies. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, my hand resting on the leather folder. I walked to the witness stand, the air heavy, all eyes fixed on me. I swore to tell the truth, my voice steady, and sat down. The folder rested on my lap, a silent shield. Harrison guided me gently through the questions. I spoke of the years of support, of the groceries, the rent payments, the emergencies that were never emergencies. I spoke of the day Melissa told me I was not special and how those words had carved into me more deeply than any blade. Dalton's cross-examination was sharp, his voice cutting. "Mrs. Matthews, isn't it true you've isolated yourself? That you've refused contact, ignored calls, cut off your only son?" I lifted my chin, my voice clear. "I did not isolate myself. I set boundaries. There's a difference." He pressed harder. "Isn't it true you've been confused, paranoid, installing cameras as if you're under attack?" I placed my hand firmly on the folder. "I am not paranoid. I am prepared. I am clearer than I have been in years." The courtroom was silent, the weight of my words settling over everyone. Dalton hesitated, then asked one final question. "Do you regret cutting your son and daughter-in-law off?" I looked at Daniel, really looked at him. His eyes avoided mine, just as they had in my living room. My voice was soft but unwavering. Love cannot be bought. If I had to pay for it, it was never real. A murmur rippled through the room. Harrison nodded at me, his expression calm but proud. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He addressed the courtroom with measured gravity. "I have heard enough. What I see is not a woman in decline, but a woman who has been manipulated and pressured. The evidence is clear. Mrs. Matthews is competent, capable, and within her rights to protect her assets." His gavel struck the wood, the sound reverberating like thunder. Request for guardianship denied. I closed my eyes, the sound echoing inside me, not as fear but as freedom. When I opened them, Daniel's face was pale, Melissa's lips tight, Dalton's shoulders stiff. Harrison placed his hand gently on my arm. It's over. As I walked out of the courtroom, the late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, bathing me in light. My hand still rested on the folder, warm now, alive. The truth had stood, even against their lies. And in that moment I understood something simple, something I had nearly forgotten. The truth does not need to shout, it only needs to stand. The sound of Judge Reynolds' gavel still echoed in my ears as I walked out of that courtroom. It wasn't just the echo of wood striking wood, it was the sound of a chain breaking, a weight sliding off my chest. For weeks I had been painted as fragile, unstable, paranoid, confused. And yet, in one decisive moment, with his ruling, all of that was swept aside. The court had declared me competent, in full control of my life and my decisions. Guardianship denied. I moved slowly down the courthouse steps, each one deliberate, savoring the feel of the ground beneath me. People brushed past, their lives untouched by mine, but for me, every breath of air outside those doors tasted like victory. Harrison walked beside me, his voice calm but firm. You did well, Mrs. Matthews. You spoke with truth, and that's what carried the day. I nodded, but words felt too small. What I felt wasn't triumph in the way they might have expected. It was release. As I reached the bottom of the steps, Daniel and Melissa stood to the side, Dalton just behind them. Melissa's face was pale with anger, her lips pinched tight. Daniel wouldn't quite look at me, but when our eyes finally met, he stepped closer. His voice was low, laced with bitterness. You'll end up alone, Mom. When you really need someone, no one will be there. I held his gaze, my voice even, not cruel but steady. I already am alone, but now it's by choice. His eyes flickered with something, anger, maybe regret, but he said nothing more. He turned, Melissa tugging at his arm, and together they walked away. I watched them go, my heart heavy but unbroken. There was no joy in seeing my son diminished, but there was clarity. That night, when I returned home, I stood in front of my door and held the new keys in my hand. They gleamed under the porch light, bright and untouched, symbols of boundaries newly drawn. The locksmith had finished only hours before. Every lock on my house had been replaced, every old key rendered useless. I slid the new one in, felt the smooth click as the tumblers turned, and stepped inside. The house welcomed me in its own quiet way. For so long it had been a place invaded by demands, by voices that drained me. Now it was mine again. I dropped the keys into a small ceramic bowl on the entry table and listened to the bright sound as they landed, a clean note of finality. In the kitchen, I filled a glass of water and stood at the counter, the leather folder of legal documents still resting there. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough, a reminder that I had chosen to fight, and I had been heard. I walked through the house slowly, running my hand along familiar walls. Each room carried echoes Daniel's laughter as a boy, birthdays filled with cake, Melissa's voice making empty promises. For years, those echoes had haunted me. Tonight, they felt like distant history, not erased, but placed firmly in the past where they belonged. When I reached my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle. It wasn't heavy silence anymore. It was chosen silence, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket rather than presses down like a stone. I whispered softly to myself, words I had never allowed before. I choose my silence. I choose my peace. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, brighter than it had in months. I got up and opened the window wide. The air rushed in, cool and fresh, carrying the sound of birds and distant traffic. It filled the room, sweeping away the stale heaviness that had lingered for so long. I stood there, the breeze on my face, and felt something that bordered on joy. I spent the day quietly. I brewed coffee and drank it slowly, not rushing, not checking my phone for messages that once dictated my every move. I walked in the garden, pulling weeds, trimming roses, grounding myself in the soil beneath my hands. Every simple act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. In the afternoon, the phone buzzed again. I glanced at it but didn't reach for it. The call went to voicemail, and I let it. The new locks were in place, the court's decision made. Whatever they wanted from me now, they would have to live without it. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a small notebook. For years I had kept ledgers of their needs, their bills, their requests. Tonight I opened a fresh page, not for them, but for me. At the top I wrote one word: plans. I listed things I had always pushed aside: travel, art classes, volunteering at the library. They weren't grand, but they were mine. The house was quiet as night fell, but I didn't feel abandoned. I felt held by the stillness. Alone, yes, but not lonely. The freedom of choosing solitude is different from the ache of being forgotten. I finally understood that. When I turned out the light, I thought again of Daniel's warning. You'll end up alone. Maybe I would. But this aloneness was not despair. It was freedom. It was the sound of a new key turning in a lock, the slam of a gavel in a courtroom, the rush of wind through an open window. And as I drifted to sleep, I knew one thing with certainty. I had chosen my silence. I had chosen my peace. And for the first time in years, the choice was entirely mine. When the mover shut the door of the truck with a final clang, I stood in front of my new apartment with nothing but 2 suitcases and a box of books. The building was smaller, humbler than the house I had fought so hard to defend, but when I turned the key and stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. The walls were freshly painted, the windows tall and bare, sunlight streaming in without obstruction. No memories lingered here, no shadows of past betrayals clung to the corners. It was a place untouched by Melissa's demands or Daniel's silence. It was mine, fully mine. The first few days I filled the room slowly. A second-hand couch, a rug with muted colors, shelves lined with books I loved but had long ignored. The small kitchen became my sanctuary, where I cooked meals for one without apology. The dining table was no longer a battlefield of papers and threats. It was where I placed fresh flowers every week, a simple act of beauty for myself. Each morning I walked through the city blocks to a community center. At first I went cautiously, unsure if I belonged, unsure if I wanted to, but the women there welcomed me. Widows, single women, mothers whose children had left and never returned. We gathered around coffee pots and folding chairs, sharing stories not of defeat but of survival. In their voices I heard echoes of my own. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the dusty blinds of the center, I shared my story aloud for the first time. The words came haltingly at first: how I had paid their rent, stocked their fridge, been told I wasn't special. Faces around the circle nodded, some eyes filled with tears, others with recognition. When I finished, silence settled, heavy but warm. A woman across from me reached out and squeezed my hand. You are not alone. It was in that circle that the seed of something larger began to grow. By the time weeks had passed, I found myself traveling again, not out of obligation but out of choice. I booked a train ticket to Boston, a city I had always wanted to see but had put off. I walked along the harbor, the salty wind tangling my hair. I visited museums, lingered in front of paintings, unhurried. For the first time in decades, I wasn't calculating if my bank account could survive another transfer to Daniel. I was living, quietly and fully, for myself. But the moment of closure came when I opened the closet in my new apartment and pulled out a garment bag I had carried through all of this. The cream-colored dress, the tags still dangled. The shoes still waited in their box. For months, it had been a symbol of exclusion, of pain. Today, I held it differently. I took it to a local women's shelter, the kind of place where women arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. When I placed the dress into the director's hands, I explained softly, it was meant for a wedding I was never invited to. Maybe now it can witness something real, something hopeful. As I walked back into the sunlight, I felt the weight of that dress lift from me forever. What had once been a symbol of my erasure was now a gift, a thread in someone else's new beginning. With the money I had protected through the court, I met with Harrison once more, not to defend myself this time, but to build. Together, we established a small foundation, modest at first, designed to support older women facing financial abuse from their own families. Each case would be handled quietly, legally, with dignity. I named it the Matthews Fund. It wasn't just about reclaiming what I had lost. It was about ensuring others wouldn't feel as alone as I once had. The first grant we gave was to a woman named Evelyn who had been forced to sign away her pension to her daughter. Watching her tears as she realized she had recourse reminded me of myself in Harrison's office, hearing those words, "You are not crazy, you are a victim." Now Evelyn could hear them too, and she could begin again. One evening, back in my apartment, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city lights flickered, distant and alive. I thought about Daniel and Melissa. I hadn't heard from them in months. Part of me wondered if Daniel regretted anything, if late at night he thought of me. Another part of me knew it didn't matter anymore. Regret wasn't mine to carry. I lifted the teacup to my lips, and in the quiet of the room, my voice came clear, as if narrating the truth I had finally claimed. True love never has a price. Freedom is never too expensive. I placed the cup down, stood, and walked to the window. Slowly, I unlatched it and pushed it open. The evening air rushed in, cool and sharp, carrying with it the sound of the city. Lights from the street spilled upward, mixing with the glow of my lamp. I leaned against the frame, the breeze touching my face, and for once I felt both alone and completely whole. I turned, as though facing not just the city but the invisible audience beyond, the ones who might hear my story, my eyes steady, my voice calm. If you were me, would you forgive, or would you finally close the door? The silence that followed was not empty. It was a question left hanging, not for me to answer anymore, but for anyone listening. And in that silence I breathed freely, the night air filling my lungs, carrying me into a future not bound by chains but built by choice. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.